there, welcome to Pride University. My name is Jasper. I work for the University of Amsterdam and I'm also volunteering for UvA Pride. That's what we're doing also this week, basically during Pride Week Amsterdam to educate people on the wider LGBTQIA plus spectrum. And one of our sessions today is coming from Michael Hunklinger on the war on sex. But before we start with your session, quickly some practical matters. You'll see a photographer, so we expect you give your consent, but if you don't, we want to be a safe space for everyone. So if you don't, please raise your hand so the photographer can quickly see who should not be on the photo. That's easy. Okay, good. And also on behalf of the Social Hub, Kira at the back, we want to welcome you to the Pride University lectures. Michael, I think it's up to you, but can you all please join me in giving you a warm welcome for this? Just try, is it better without microphone or with microphone? With, okay. Well then, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming to our Pride University. Thank you also for organizing that, because as a social scientist, or in my case a political scientist, working on LGBTQ and queer issues, it is a lot of the time where you have to justify what you do and why you research that. Not here, not during Pride, then everyone is always very excited, but I'm very grateful also for the Social Hub, but Pride University and the University of Amsterdam for having this opportunity. So I'm going to talk for roughly 45 minutes maybe, then we have some time for Q&A, and if you have in between some questions, we can also always find and accommodate that. Let me start with some preliminary remarks. If we talk about what I, in a bit out of a limb, talk called the war on sex, or just the polarization around gender and sexuality issues. So if we look at LGBTQ plus issues at the moment from a worldwide perspective, then we can see a move forward towards more equality concerning LGBTQ rights. That is something, if we look into the tradition of political and legal progress in many countries, with a very much focus of Western European countries, Western countries, but also North America. So we see adoption of same-sex marriage, we see an increase of anti-discrimination measurements, so we just see all over the world a lot of progress in this. At the same time, we see something that I just called the legal backlash. If you look in the United States, for example, or Hungary, where there is new anti-trans legislation. So we also see on the legislative aspect of this issue that there is what I would call a backlash. At the same time, there is something, a little teaser about what I'm going to talk about a little bit in later. It's what I call a political apathy versus a polarization. So I argue in a bit that we have both right now. And what we also see, and I think that the talk we just had on AI was a very good example for that we have increasingly developments that try to push queer agenda or queer issues out of the political arena towards, like, it's not our responsibility, it's big tech, for example, or also it's like a legal issue, or it's education, or it's health. So there is this tendency to depoliticize a lot of queer LGBTQ plus issues. That is not the case, I'll argue, and we'll see today. And also, omnipresence and marginalization. You probably, since most of you are probably Dutch, you rode your bike here, so on your way here you probably saw a lot of rainbow flags everywhere. The Pride Hub here is very present, so it's really good to have this visibility, but at the same time it's really important to remember that there is still marginalization going on. There's a lot of people within the community that face discrimination and exclusion right now. 2 sentences about my research or research on LGBTQ plus in general. It is, from a political science perspective, a very, rather new research field. There's some people also in the room who do really great research here on LGBTQ plus issues. But as with queering AI, for example, it's always the case that there is not a lot of funding for those issues. There's not a lot of money. There's also not a lot of attention. So that's why it's even cooler to have the position right now I have at the UFA and to do research like that. My main argument, and then I'm going to really start, is that LGBTQ or queer issues are one of the key issues or key cleavages in the political science term of like dividing societies that divide our societies in the world. But before I do that, I want to bring you in a little bit and collect some challenges for LGBTQ people right now. What would you say if I asked you right now, what are challenges that we as a community, that queer people in general face right now? Queering AI is not an option.
Not taken serious by the majority.
Yeah, as in not being taken serious. Yeah.
Some of them might face criminal sentences because they are LGBT people in some countries.
Yeah, like really persecution by law in some countries. So criminalization, yes. Yeah.
Tolerization. I feel like as a society we are becoming less and less tolerant towards, for example, LGBTQ+.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Discrimination on housing and employment. Even
Yes.
if it's explicitly forbidden. Because
Yeah.
you have to prove it and you have to have money to fight for legal power.
That is also a very good point, that there, in a lot of cases, there are some anti-discrimination laws maybe, but they are not being implemented. So yeah, that's a very good point. 2 or 3 more issues, yeah?
Yeah, being subject to verbal or physical violence because of your identity.
Yeah, we do see a rise on violence. I'm also gonna talking about that in a bit. One more from this side, anyone? Oh, yeah, sorry.
Visibilization of structural inequalities based on gender and sexual orientation.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you can see, what we just collected in 2 minutes in this room is already a very broad amount of issues that we still have and challenge about LGBTQ politics right now, what we talk about, what happens when we talk about this issue. But I just said when we talk about this issue, about queer politics, about LGBTQ politics, what does it even mean talking about those issues? And then I think we're already at the first problem we face here, because the talking away about talking is already like political in this sense. So I brought you 2 examples of 2 different strains of thought, how to think about or talk about also LGBTQ issues or queer issues. On the left you see the letters. You see a lot of the time, a lot of you are very familiar with this umbrella term. It is the most inclusive I could find right now. So it has just all the people divided into very much different categories. This comes from a very liberal tradition, from a US perspective mainly, from a neoliberal perspective, where there's a focus of individual rights, where there's a focus on individual laws and progress. On the other hand, we have queer that originated as a slur for being weird, being an outsider, and that is more and more used from a leftist or like an emancipatory and progressive point of view. So just know that whenever you talk about those issues, those are like the dimensions that also are behind those issues. But what should we use now? What are the correct terms to use? YouGov did actually just this June a big survey in the UK and asked what was the preferred umbrella term for the community. So LGBTQ+ is the one that won here with those respondents in the survey. And what's really interesting is queer is just under 1%. It's of course in the UK context different, but yes.
Yeah, I was just asking if this was in the UK.
Yeah, it's in the UK context also where the word queer right now is still used also as a slur or as like a term of discrimination. But that's of course is also really interesting because in the academic debate we are seeing somehow shifting from a progressive perspective to the term queer, and also in a lot of activist spaces. But if we look at the general queer community, then we also see that LGBTQ+ is considered one of the most inclusive terms. I just brought you a really brief definition of queer, and for me in this talk I'm gonna just use LGBTQ+ and queer interchangeably because it's from different perspectives. If I talk about a theoretical perspective, I might use queer more often. If I talk about more empirical issues or rights issue, I might talk about LGBTQ plus issues. So that brings us to why we're here, Pride, about a very, I brought you two pictures here about Pride. Before that, I want to do a little quiz. So one is pretty easy, the other one is a bit harder. Who do you see on the pictures and which countries do you think those pictures are from? The first one gets...
Justin Trudeau.
Yeah, and is? Justin Trudeau is? Which country? Canada, yes. And the one to the right?
Also Canada.
Also Canada is not right.
So,
Almost?
Georgia?
Hungary.
Yeah, almost a bit more south. It's Belgrade. It's in Serbia. Yeah, oh, sorry. Yeah. So yeah, it is Belgrade Pride, during Belgrade Pride, so we have two very different dimensions of pride that have been taken in the last couple of years. If we look at Amsterdam Pride right now, this Saturday, would you say it's more party or it's more protest?
Party.
Let's do a raise of hands. Who is for party? And who is for protest? Okay, maybe it's both, maybe it's not, but I think that's a discussion we will have about. And before we do that, I'm gonna do another quiz because I wanna go back a little bit in the history of Pride and talk about that with you. You see two bars here. On the left, the Black Cat in LA, and on the right, the Stonewall Inn. Does anyone know one of those two bars? Yeah? Stonewall. Who knows Stonewall? Who has heard of Stonewall? Who has heard about the Black Cat? Oh, yeah, well, at least one person here. That's really interesting because the first ever gay protest or like LGBTQ protest in the US took place at the Black Cat in LA in 1967. So that was a peaceful protest. We see one picture actually exists from this protest in 1967, and it protested the police violence against the people who frequented this bar. On the right hand, you see the only real picture ever existed from the Stonewall Inn riots in 1969, so 2 years later. However, what's really interesting is that we all, as a collective memory, have more Stonewall as like a point of memory. So that might have to do with the violence, but also with the media attention that got, because on the left-hand side, there was no media attention to peaceful protests. So this might also be one sign of why the protesters in those times shifted to more violent protests. Briefly for most of you who probably don't know that, but Stonewall was in 1969 a bar in the Christopher Street in New York, and it was a very popular queer or gay bar, and it was raided by the police very frequently with a lot of violence. And there have been protests before, but the big riots were in June 1969. There is one, in one of the pictures, I think you can do like up there, that says something that has to do with the mafia. Has anyone an idea what the mafia has to do with queer liberation, with gay bars, or with New York City? Yes? Yes, the mafia owned the Stonewall bar. Why do you think, does it make sense for the mafia to own a bar, like for like gay bars in New York? Yeah?
It was easier for them to keep the police at bay.
Yes? Yeah? Also, very good point. I think that's always a good point with the mafia. Another idea? Yes, exactly. And also, like, of course, people who are in politics or in business and who go to those bars, who frequent those bars, they had pictures taken, so it's also like a way of making money with yeah, just like pressuring those people into being out. So the mafia actually had several gay bars all over the world. So it's really interesting if you look at those connections between organized crime and minorities. So Stonewall, that we already know so much about this, or as like a queer reference point, also has to do with this book, which was a very interesting and important book for the US context from the political science perspective, where we talked about this myth of Stonewall. And on the right, you can also see the memorial for the Stonewall riots, which I think is a very interesting choice for a memorial for violent riots. It's just those people talking, so I don't know who made this choice. But what about Europe? When do you think were the first gay, queer, or lesbian protests in the Netherlands recorded? 90s, 70s, 60s?
I just heard in another session, 67 was the first one at Inholland in the Hague.
Yes. That is true. But 67, yeah, it's right, it's a typo. So 67, because the interesting thing is also that the Netherlands, here again, were like with peaceful protests about the same time when the US happened, when all of that happened, but with the violence, they did not do that much here. Christopher Street Day is always used, or a lot of the time used, as a synonym for pride. Does anyone have an idea why that is? I kind of gave it away, so it's a little bit of a test how much you paid attention. Yeah?
It's the address of the Stonewall Inn.
Yes. It's the address of the Stonewall Inn, and also that's why it was chosen by the first organizers of the first ever Pride to be as inclusive as possible and not only have a gay pride, so it was just like the Christopher Street, so other people who went to this. I already brought two dates, like the first Pride in Berlin took place in 1979, and the first UK Pride took place in 1972, so the 1970s really is when the Pride started. But what are the issues, or what are like the themes that were protested and were talked about during Pride? So in the 1980s, it was very much about coming out of the closet, not being underground, being visible in society. I brought some pictures here. I don't know, does anyone recognize this gentleman? Yes.
Yes.
So just pay attention, he might come back on the slides later. So I think that was very much also what we see here, lesbian and gay pride here in the UK. So we see very much is just coming out of, in quotation, out of the shadows, but just being recognizable and visible in society. Also, we need research and not hysteria, very well connected to the AIDS epidemic that started here. AIDS also remained an issue right through the 90s. What we see in the 90s more and more is a diversification of also signs and protests. As an example, I brought you the New York bisexual woman. So we see a diversification in the protest movement, and we also see that there's a shift towards a more legal attitude. So protesting, for example, the Section 28, which is a law in the UK that is very discriminatory and criminalizes queer and LGBTQ people. So what we see from the 80s to the 90s is a shift from the society issues more to legal issues. If we go forward, yes?
Can we make the first now, or you prefer at the end?
Yeah, let's do the end. Perfect. So if we continue that and go into the 2000s, I brought you to three pictures from, once again, Ian McKellen. So he's a very prominent Pride figure in the UK, but also even more focused on same-sex marriage, on adoption. So even more this turn within the Pride movement to protest more legal elements. So what we really can see is this shift from society to more political legal aspect. Of course, it is only very simplified. I usually can do a whole semester about that, but for today, that's it. In the 2010s, then we see also a shift to more like a corporate side of Pride. We see what we did talk about last year about pinkwashing. So we see more and more companies here including and seeing that, oh, maybe trying to be diverse or just showing to be diverse is good for our business. So that is something that we really see, but also an increasing attention on trans issues is something that we really see during the time. So what do you think, who was the first company that ever did advertising for queer people or gay people?
Coca-Cola?
Coca-Cola?
Absolute vodka.
Yes, Absolute Vodka. In 1981. And it's really interesting because it's a very nice ad they placed in a gay magazine, and it's coming out of the closet, so it's a double meaning for for coming out as homosexual, as trans, or whatever other sexual minority or gender identity, but also it's a little pun on the prohibition. So it's also this very interesting but also very good advertisement. And in the case of Absolute Vodka, for example, you see that a company that really supports the community also with funds from the 80s till now. So Coca-Cola, sorry, it doesn't really. So. Starbucks also doesn't anymore. So that's also really interesting that we see a shift that some companies in some countries really go away from supporting Pride. On the left you see Pride in Every Cup, a Star Wars commercial from a couple of years ago, but this year actually in the United States, Starbucks ordered their employees to take down rainbow flags because they don't want to polarize, they don't want to pay attention to that. We all know those arguments. So we see that's also just not a one-way street here. If we look at the parade on Saturday, if we see at 2023, what are issues you think that are being promoted or protested? The theme is "We Are Included," which sounds like a very nice theme, but it's a bit blurry. I don't want to criticize anyone too much, but what do you think are issues that 2020s will bring here for the queer community?
Intersectionality.
Yes.
Intersex.
Yeah.
Health
Very
issues.
good topic.
Health.
Health issues. Yes, we will talk about healthcare for trans people in a bit. Yes.
Federal votes on refugees?
Yes, we will really talk about that. Also for how inclusive do we want to be for in terms of borders, who is part of our society. Yes, that's I think a very good point.
The rise in anti-LGBTQ laws around Europe and the world?
Yes, we do see that, and I'm gonna talk about that in a bit, about the really rise in polarization, but into hate speech, but also the rise in violence.
And 25 years after the gay games.
Yeah, totally. Any? Yeah.
I mean, I think the fact that there is, apart from Pride Amsterdam, now also Queer Amsterdam the week before, and the fact that it couldn't be included into Pride Amsterdam, I think is also telling, painting a picture about some issues.
Yes.
Maybe mostly also about the commercialization of Pride.
Yeah, and also it's a lot of infight within the community, and also a diversification that of course has its positive sides but also its negative sides. So we see that with all the success we have. I'll talk about that in about 4 minutes maybe, that we have more legal rights for some people but less for other people. Yeah.
I think I saw it on the museum square, the many flags of different countries that are that being LGBT people, they are sentenced to death or sentenced to 20 or 25 years in prison, something
Yeah.
like that. So I think that links with the theme, we are all included, what you said, we are included.
Yeah, and I think it's also that our focus really shifts in the 20s, will shift a bit outside of Europe and a bit in other parts of the world. So just to bring you 3 examples before I talk about current challenges a bit more, is Pride parades is not the only way queer people protest. I brought you 3 ones that I really like. It's graffiti is a really interesting style, and it's also one of my research focuses, where I do research on street art and different forms of political participation for marginalized groups who might not have other ways to reach public debates. But also a protest in Vienna during the New Year's concert where the people just stormed on the stage naked and protested gay rights, human rights for gay people, and also, as you see, an anti-AIDS boycott here and a political demonstration at the Wall Street. So what I want to show with this picture, there's way more activism within the queer community than only on pride issues, but that's not the focus of today's talk. So what is the focus or what are the big challenges? I'm gonna really talk about, really briefly about the polarization and political apathy, state inclusion and state homophobia, and then we'll have a guest speaker for trans issues. Before I go in there, ILGA, the International Lesbian Gay Association, really presented their new rainbow map this past month, and it shows the progress on the legal level of concerning LGBTQ and queer issues. So they also do a country ranking, and I added ILGA Europe because I just had dinner with someone from ILGA World last weekend, and they're like, yeah, no, the country ranking is something only ILGA Europe does. So ILGA World is not really in favor of that, because of course it does do a very Eurocentric and also like a Western Eurocentric view on that. So what we really see here, it is a very good indicator also for governments where we stand, but also it's very problematic because living conditions are just different in different countries. And it's also like a different context for activism. Is anyone surprised by anything on this map, or not really? Slovakia?
And Czech, they're
Yeah.
not very.
Yeah? Why are you surprised?
I thought they are very unreligious, so they probably be more adaptive.
Yeah, and that is, religion plays a very big role, yeah?
Yeah, when I first saw this map a couple of years ago, I was surprised that Netherlands wasn't higher. Now my view has changed, but
Yeah, one big, that's like, I did a similar event yesterday, and they were all like, oh, but I thought in the Netherlands we were #1, but oh, sorry, you're not. But that's also like Malta being one shows that also there is a lot of shortcomings with this index here, because of course Malta is still a very religious country and the society is very, very much conservative, but there is a lot of legal equality. However, if we look at issues like abortion, Malta is very restrictive, so it's really important to always, if you look at that, and also always say that to my students, if you see maps like that, just ask them first, where's the data from, why, does it make sense? But for us here, it's really good to show that concerning LGBTQ rights, there is a big east-west divide right now. What we also see when I talk about both the polarization within society and the political apathy, that's what I mean when we have both at the same time right now in many Western societies. So we do have a lot of right-wing populist parties, but also activists who really target the queer community, especially the trans community, but also the community as a whole. We have also on other sides of the political spectrum, like conservative parties who really turn more and more against also queer people just because it's an easy target. So we have a very polarizing issue. And that also goes back a little bit to what I said earlier. We sometimes don't know how to talk about issues. And that is going to be really increasingly more and more. And I think that's something that's very interesting for me as a researcher, but it's also very threatening because we see also a rise in hate speech and a rise in violence. So we really see all those things happening. At the same time, we have a majority of the people who are like, oh yeah, we're fine. Nothing, it's okay. So what we see also in all the big surveys, they are like the acceptance for same-sex marriage, for example, or for gay or lesbian neighbors, they are all very growing. But at the same time, we see those are maybe not the best measurements how to really measure queerphobia. Because we see that I can be very tolerant to my neighbors being gay, but still be homophobic on the internet. So everything is getting a little bit more complex. And I think what's really important here is also for us as a queer community, what we see especially with gay men who have, for me, for example, living as a white gay man in Amsterdam, I have pretty much all the rights. I'm pretty much fine. But that doesn't mean that other parts of the community don't like have the same like privileges that I have. So what is really important here is to not be political apathetic, but also like see that this is still our fight here. Issues we have, some kind of pictures I brought here are of very violent protests in Russia, for example, or also to the left in Serbia again, where we see that right-wing parties, often in government, also really target the queer community, or here, for example, gay couples as their like main enemy to unite their voters. And that's also something that we really see is two men having sex does not necessarily have anything to do with your sexual orientation. It probably does, but you just can't really be sure. What we also see is, I brought this sign of the store that says heterosexuals only. So we also see a rise in like those little forms of like micro discriminations, I would say. So does it do any harm? Probably not if you walk by, but if you are queer, if you read that, especially if you're queer youth, then you really see that there's a difference, and that really makes an impact. There is a new study from the Trevor Project in the US that really found that the mental health of queer youth is very well affected by the rising polarization and by the rising hate speech here in the United States. So also that's what I call like the micro discriminations are something you really have to taking care. And also online space, we talked about AR a little bit before, so AI is a very big issue here in this. I brought also what's really interesting for the first time in the last Spanish election, the Spanish right-wing party Vox really also like posted this like advertisement in the big house, I think it was in Madrid, where they have this hand throwing away all what they don't want to have belong in the society. And as you can see, it's also next to some feminist issues, also the LGBTQ inclusive rainbow flag. So we really see that an increase in the political homophobia. We also see an increase in society in homophobia. But at the same time, we say if you go back, there's a lot of people like, yeah, well, they can marry. So what do they want? So we also see this, as long as we have rainbow flags flying, we're fine. I just want to make this point that we're maybe not. Just two sentences about the role of the state. As a political scientist, I'm also always really interested in what is the context of the state. I brought the picture to the left. Does anyone have an idea what that picture depicts? Yes?
I think it's the first gay marriage in the Netherlands, right?
Yes, and the first gay marriage in the Netherlands was also the first gay marriage in Amsterdam, in the world, I mean. Does anyone have an idea when that was? Yes, 2001. It's the Dutch audience knows things like that. But also I brought on the right. It was the first time a couple of years ago that the rainbow flag was put on the Berlin Parliament of the Reichstagsgebäude. So what we really see is more and more countries, including what I said, state inclusion of queer issues, of LGBTQ issues, but mainly gay and lesbian issues, if we're going to be right. So what we can see is the state inclusion is something that is happening, and I don't want to deny that. But at the same time, I want to mainly talk now about state homophobia. That is also something that's a reality for many people here in this world. I brought you to the left a sticker from which country? Do you think could the left be? Poland. Does anyone have an idea what the sticker protests or what the sticker is about?
LGBT-free marriage.
Yes. So a couple of years ago, there was this initiative by the peace government that supported so-called LGBTQ plus, not plus, LGBT free zones, which meant that there should be spaces in local community that are free of LGBT people. Which of course does not make any sense, but it's very, very interesting that this is a very hard take here for the people in the communities, for the activists, but also just for maybe just a trans person growing up here. So what we really see, there was a really big impact, But also there was a good backlash, so I think that's very good. And in the end, it's all about money, so the EU pressured them to take them back, withheld some funds, and it was a very big and long discussion, which is also sheds not the best light on the European Union. But in the end, there were some resolutions, and Poland officially dissolved the LGBTQ plus free zones. However, they are still a very homophobic government. To the right, has anyone an idea what the one to the right is? The lady is a bookseller, and she carries the book Heartstopper.
American bookstore in Florida.
Yeah, it's a bookstore, yes. Florida, no, it's closer to home. Hungary, yes. It's Hungary, and it's a picture of a bookseller who, for the first time, had to pay a fee because they were selling what's so-called like gay propaganda. Here in Heartstopper is a very popular graphic novel right now. It's very, very sweet. But it's now outlawed to sell that in Hungarian book shops. So this book seller, for the first time, I think it was a couple months ago, had to pay really fees by the government for selling gay propaganda. So what we really can see is different ways of influencing society that is happening by right-wing governments. But also, I called it the war on sex also on Europe and beyond. I brought you two examples, and now we're in Florida. With the left is Governor Ron DeSantis, who might or might not be the next president of the United States, signing a bill that's called the Don't Say Gay bill. It, of course, in the real name is something about protecting parents and children and blah, something like that. But basically, you're not allowed to talk about sexual orientation or gender identity in schools anymore in Florida. And that really makes a difference for teachers, for students, but also for those families there. If it does not even mean that you have to educate them, it's not even included in the curricula, it's really forbidden to just mention that as a teacher and you can be suspended. And I think that's something that's very dangerous, and that's something we see in more European, not European, US states here. So this focus on education is something that is really also growing. From your side right, we see a picture from the parliament in Uganda. Uganda passed this year very restrictive laws against gays, and what's really nice, they call it lesbianism, whatever that is. But it's not as funny as it sounds, because it really can imprison people supporting gay people. So if I'm staying at your house, you can now be imprisoned. But more importantly, it really is the death sentence for people acting as homosexual. Here, mainly, of course, focused on gay men, but of course, this is something that really affects the whole community. What's really interesting is also that the biggest funders for the campaign that the Ugandan parliament really introduced this law were big right-wing conservative and religious groups from the United States, but also from Europe. So what we really see here is an increasing engagement of right-wing groups and a lot of right-wing money that goes towards countries in Africa, for example, that probably only have those laws here right now because we colonized them at some point. Well, the Dutch maybe more than others, but so what we really can see is that we're spreading this. It's going to be more and more a transnational issue, and that we see from Hungary, Poland, from European countries, to also a very good example, like just recently in Italy, the Meloni government really revoked the right for two lesbian couples for them both be mothers. So a lot of children in lesbian relationships not only have one mother left legally, so there's a lot of issues right now where governments here in the United States, but also within Europe here, target issues. But there is more than just Europe here. We also want to talk about the Netherlands, and yeah, let's skip the EU.